Pam Bondi thought she was untouchable until Karoline Leavitt showed her what quiet strength really looks like. In a live TV debate that started with smiles and subtle jabs, one personal threat flipped the script, and what happened next left even the moderator speechless. Karoline didn't shout, she didn't flinch, she just told the truth, and in doing so, turned the entire room and half the country against Bondi. This isn't just a debate, it's a defining moment about what real leadership, real motherhood, and real courage looks like in today's America. And the ending? Let's just say, it's the kind of justice that doesn't need a gavel to be felt. The lights in the studio glowed with a kind of soft, false comfort, a manufactured warmth that masked the chill underneath. Behind the polished glass table sat four women, all seasoned voices in American politics. The studio's backdrop glimmered with patriotic blue hues, a subtle American flag gently waving on the screen behind them. On the surface, it looked like just another primetime panel on legal accountability and leadership in the modern era. But underneath, something else stirred. Something bigger than debate. Something older than policy. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in American history, adjusted the mic clip to her blazer. Just 4 months ago, she had given birth to her first child, a boy named Michael after her late brother. The sleepless nights and healing body weren't visible in her posture, but they lingered in her eyes. She had the look of someone who'd walked through fire and kept going. Across from her sat Pam Bondi, sharp as ever. The former Florida Attorney General had spent the last decade building a media persona that was part Southern charm, part steel-jawed legal warrior. She knew how to work a camera. She also knew how to wound with words and smile while doing it. The conversation had started harmlessly enough. The moderator, a carefully neutral brunette with decades in broadcast, opened with a broad question about the current state of legal trust in America. Karoline responded with a calm analysis of recent Supreme Court decisions. Pam nodded in agreement. There was a sense of false peace, a political ceasefire. But for anyone watching closely, the tension was already threading its way through the room. Karoline's presence had stirred something. Maybe it was her age. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't carry the usual beltway polish. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because she didn't shrink. And in rooms like these, when a woman refuses to shrink, something always snaps. She had made her way to the table that afternoon, not with bravado, but with purpose. Her hair pulled back neatly, cross necklace glinting under the studio lights, she looked every bit the picture of composure. But beneath it, a storm. She had come not just to participate, but to set something straight. And as the second segment began, the moderator shifted gears. Let's talk about leadership and legal responsibility in today's America. That's when it happened. Pam leaned back in her chair, that practiced television smile never quite reaching her eyes. You know, Karoline, I admire your energy, truly. But let me give you a word of advice, from one woman in power to another. Motherhood is beautiful, but politics is brutal. You might want to decide which one you want to survive in. For a moment, it didn't register. The words floated, soft and saccharine, but they landed like daggers. The camera didn't catch the slight twitch in Karoline's fingers as she folded her hands, or the way her jaw set, not in anger, but in resolve. Across living rooms in America, across dining tables and church fellowship halls where viewers gathered to watch, people leaned in. Did she just say that? Mothers watching, grandmothers, widows, women who had juggled sick babies and held down jobs, women who had buried husbands and held families together through war, recession, and heartbreak. They heard it. They knew exactly what had been said. It wasn't just about Karoline. It was about them. It was a reminder that even now, in a world that claimed to be modern and inclusive and fair, there were still those who believed a woman had to choose. Pam's words weren't just condescending. They were dangerous. And Karoline didn't blink. She didn't interrupt. She didn't laugh or scoff or roll her eyes. She just waited. And somewhere in that silence, the kind that no stage lighting could fill, She made a decision. She would not let it pass. She would not let that threat hang in the air like gospel truth. Because women like Karoline Leavitt had learned that if you let those comments go unchecked, they grow. They become permission for others to speak the same way. They become precedent, and not on her watch. In the control room, a producer whispered into his headset, "Cut to Karoline." Now, the camera shifted. Her eyes didn't waver. Her lips parted. But what came next wasn't just a response. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Caroline's fingers rested gently on the glass table, the studio light catching the edge of her wedding ring and the silver cross around her neck. She didn't rush, didn't fidget. The silence stretched long enough to make the control room sweat, and long enough for the audience at home to stop scrolling, stop sipping their coffee, and just listen. Then softly she spoke. "You know, Pam, I've walked into courtrooms while still bleeding." The words dropped like stones. 4 days after giving birth to my son, I was on a stage in Pennsylvania, watching the man I work for nearly assassinated on live television. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I stood next to him because the job didn't wait, and neither did the truth. She wasn't shouting, but she didn't need to. The weight of her voice settled over the room like snowfall, quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. You want to talk about what's brutal? Brutal is burying your brother at 17 and still showing up to class the next morning because your mother said you don't get to stop. Brutal is having strangers call you a puppet, a pawn, a pretty face for someone else's agenda, while you hold classified briefings in rooms filled with men twice your age who won't make eye contact with you. She paused, then turned her gaze directly to Bondi. And brutal, Pam, is being told by a woman who should know better that motherhood and leadership are somehow opposites? Bondi blinked. Karoline didn't break eye contact. I didn't survive childbirth to be warned about survival by someone who's never had to answer a 3 a.m. call from a NICU nurse. And I didn't come here to be lectured on brutality by someone who uses compassion like it's a political costume, worn when convenient, folded when not. The studio was silent. Still, even the moderator, usually quick to redirect tension, had lost her words. Karoline leaned forward just slightly, just enough to let everyone know she wasn't finished. You say I should choose between motherhood and politics? I say, that is why I'm here. Because my son will grow up in a country shaped by the choices we make today. And I refuse to let him inherit a system where strength is mistaken for coldness, or where nurturing is seen as a weakness. She turned to the audience, knowing exactly where the camera lens was. My generation isn't asking for permission to lead and raise children at the same time. We're doing it, and it doesn't make us weaker. It makes us whole. Bondi shifted in her seat. Her hands, which had rested elegantly folded just moments ago, were now twitching against the table edge. You want to know what legal backbone looks like, Pam? It's not being loud. It's not being cruel. It's knowing who you are, even when the world tries to shame you out of it. Karoline's voice softened. I wear this cross not for decoration, but because I believe in grace, even for those who try to cut you down on national television. The control room cut to a wide shot. The silence in the studio was no longer tense. It was reverent. Somewhere in the third row, a studio crew member wiped her eyes. Back home, on couches in South Carolina, in barbershops in Ohio, in diners in rural Missouri, people watched a young woman draw a line. A mother, a leader, a believer. Not with fists, not with fury, but with facts, with truth, and with the kind of quiet strength the world doesn't know how to fight. Bondi opened her mouth, but the moment was gone, and Karoline, she had just begun. The segment ended without ceremony, no closing summary, no tidy wrap-up from the moderator. Just a slow fade to commercial, a shot of Bondi's frozen expression, and Karoline's steady profile still burned into the screen as the music cut in late. Even the crew looked shaken. Behind the scenes, no one spoke at first. The control room, normally a buzzing hive of tech chatter and director commands, was dead silent. Someone finally whispered, "Did that really just happen?" The moment hadn't just aired, it had landed. And within minutes, the world outside the studio was already responding. The first clip hit Twitter at 8:02 p.m. It was just 47 seconds long, titled, "Karoline Leavitt Just Redefined Motherhood on Live TV." By 8:07 p.m., it had 12,000 retweets. By 8:30, TikTok had half a dozen stitched reactions. And by 9 o'clock, cable news producers were calling interns and yelling, "Get us that footage, now!" Back in the green room, Karoline sat quietly. She sipped water. Her hands were still. Across the hall, Bondi slammed the door behind her. Her team moved fast, drafting statements, calling friendly pundits, prepping spin. But it was too late, because what had happened wasn't a gaffe. It wasn't a misquote. It was a moment, and America had seen it. Across the country, living rooms went quiet. Seniors in retirement homes leaned forward. Single moms texted each other. "Did you just see that?" Veterans, fathers, daughters, people who didn't always agree on politics, sat up and said, "That woman? She just said what needed saying." Karoline's words echoed in Facebook posts, in group chats, in emails titled, "You need to watch this." One clip captured the moment Karoline said, "I didn't survive childbirth to be warned about survival by someone who's never had to answer a 3 a.m. call from a NICU nurse." That line hit home. A grandmother in Nebraska reposted it with the caption, "This girl reminds me of the way my daughter stood up to the school board. Calm, clear, unshaken." A Vietnam vet from North Carolina comment, "She's got more spine than most of DC." Even conservative hosts, usually eager to spotlight Bondi, hesitated because the audience wasn't buying the spin this time. Karoline hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted anyone. She hadn't mocked or interrupted. She'd just spoken, and people recognized that kind of truth. The old-fashioned kind, rooted in faith and forged in hardship. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about character. That night, Karoline turned off her phone. She didn't scroll through the comments. She didn't look for applause. Instead, she kissed her son goodnight, tucked him into bed, and whispered, "One day, I'll tell you why I said what I said." Meanwhile, Pam Bondi sat with her advisors, eyes on her inbox. No congratulations, no thank you messages, no rallying support. Just a growing silence, a silence she hadn't expected. And in that silence, the story was no longer hers. It belonged to Karoline, to the mothers, to the fighters, to the quiet warriors who don't always get the microphone. But when they do, they make it count, and the country listens. By morning, headlines wrapped around the globe. Young press secretary silences the room with one line. Leavitt versus Bondi. The moment that changed the conversation. Mother, leader, fighter, Karoline Leavitt redefines the role. Pam Bondi's name still trended, but for all the wrong reasons. News outlets replayed the exchange in slow motion. Body language experts broke it down frame by frame. Commentators tried to reframe the narrative, but the public wasn't having it, because they had already seen everything they needed to see. Pam tried damage control on a familiar morning radio show. She offered the usual politician's lifeline. My comments were taken out of context. I respect Karoline tremendously. I just meant that the balance between motherhood and public service is tough for all of us. But even the host hesitated before responding. Sure, Pam, but some folks say it sounded like a threat or a warning. Pam laughed, light, rehearsed. That wasn't my intention at all. But the crack had already formed, and the public? They remembered tone just as much as words. What truly stung was the silence from her usual allies. No one stepped forward to defend her. No Fox News tweet. No op-ed from familiar conservative voices. Even her political mentors remained quiet, letting the moment pass like it never happened. Meanwhile, Karoline didn't post anything. She didn't need to. She appeared briefly at a town hall in New Hampshire. No mention of the viral moment. Just a soft-spoken opening about what it means to serve, to speak truth with grace, and to raise a child in a world that often punishes the honest. The crowd, largely senior citizens and veterans, stood when she finished. And that video, it made its way online too. One woman wrote, "I'm 74. I've lived through 7 presidents. I've never cried during a town hall until today." Another, "She reminds me of Margaret Thatcher, but with the heart of a mother." Back in Florida, Pam was facing more than just online backlash. Producers at major networks began quietly rotating her out of panels. Not publicly, but consistently. A scheduling conflict here, a postponed appearance there. The kind of slow fade that doesn't require an announcement, just absence. She noticed. Her assistant did too. "They're not confirming you for the roundtable next week, Pam. They said they're trying something fresh." Fresh. That word stung worse than the silence, because it meant that in the eyes of the media she once dominated, she was old news. And worse, it wasn't because she lost a debate, it was because she lost the room. That's what made it all so bitter. Pam had built her brand on confidence, on poise, on the ability to cut others down without breaking a sweat. But in one moment, she'd been met with something her training never prepared her for. A woman who didn't need to fight dirty, a woman who stood in truth and let the silence speak for itself. Karoline hadn't yelled, she hadn't smirked, she hadn't strutted, she'd stood her ground, like a mother, like a leader, like a woman who had endured more in the last year than many do in a lifetime. And America noticed. Because in a political landscape where outrage is currency, Karoline had offered something rare: stillness, strength, and sincerity. And that was more powerful than anything Pam could have prepared for. As the week wore on, commentary shifted. Past clips of Bondi resurfaced. Old controversies, campaign donations, past remarks about other women. It all re-entered the public consciousness like a slow wave. And the more people watched Karoline's calm, the more they questioned the tone of so many others. She had raised the standard, without ever asking to. That's what happens when someone stops performing and starts telling the truth. And now, the country was listening in a new way, not to noise, but to stillness. And in that stillness, something had shifted forever. 3 weeks passed. The headlines faded, as headlines do. New scandals, new sound bites, a new political spat somewhere on Capitol Hill. But something about that night, about Karoline's stillness, her conviction, had embedded itself in the public memory. It was no longer about viral clips. It was about what people felt when they watched her speak. She was invited to speak at Liberty University, then Hillsdale, then to a bipartisan panel of mothers in leadership roles. Not flashy events, not ego-driven panels. Just rooms filled with people, mostly older, many deeply faithful, who wanted to understand how she held her ground with such grace. She didn't boast. She didn't relive the debate. Instead, she talked about Michael, her son, about the strength it takes to come back from childbirth, not physically, but spiritually, about the cost of truth in a world that treats it like a political prop. One moment stood out. A retired judge stood during Q&A at an event in Georgia. His voice cracked. "My wife passed last year," he said, "and in my grief I forgot what dignity looked like. Watching you reminded me." Karoline stepped down from the stage. She walked to him, and she hugged him. No cameras, no hashtags, just two people in a moment of shared humanity. Back in Florida, Pam Bondi wasn't done. Not officially. She'd appear now and then, always polished, always prepared. But something had changed. Producers booked her with asterisks. Panels brought her on later, not first. Her name no longer carried the same force. And in the green rooms, the younger voices, many of them women, spoke about Karoline. Not in the way people talk about political figures, but in the way people talk about someone who reminded them of something they forgot. That quiet doesn't mean weak. That motherhood doesn't mean small. That dignity doesn't expire. Pam saw it. She felt it in the way people nodded politely but didn't lean in how her quotes were never the ones that trended anymore. She had played the game so long, she forgot what happened when someone simply refused to play. Months later, the clips still lived online, tucked into comment threads, used in classrooms, even shared in church bulletins. But Karoline never mentioned it again. She never needed to, because legacy isn't something you claim. It's something you leave behind in the silence after you speak. And for thousands of women, especially mothers, widows, grandmothers who had once been told they had to choose between being heard and being gentle, Karoline Leavitt had drawn a line in the sand. And when Bondi crossed it, she found herself on the wrong side of history. So when people say, "What happened to Pam Bondi after that panel?" you tell them this: she faded. But Karoline, she began. If this story moved you, if you believe dignity still matters in American leadership, if you believe that the strongest voice in the room doesn't have to be the loudest, then share this, because truth needs no defense, only witnesses. And you just became one.